Welcome to the Real Free News audio podcast. Today, we explore cultural differences in how racial and ethnic groups form communities in modern America, reveals varying approaches to social spaces and organizations. Some groups emphasize explicit identity, while others gather under universal themes, raising questions about balance, reciprocity, and preservation in a diverse society. In contemporary American society, the ways in which different racial and ethnic groups gather and maintain social spaces reveal profound asymmetries that reflect broader patterns of identity, power, and cultural preservation. White Americans, particularly those of non-Jewish and non-recent immigrant backgrounds, tend to congregate in large numbers within institutions and events that are framed as universal, functional, or locally oriented rather than explicitly racial. These include public schools in suburban or rural areas, high school sports events, workplaces in certain sectors, churches of various Protestant denominations, fraternal organizations such as Veterans of Foreign Wars halls or Rotary clubs, and recreational activities tied to regional traditions like county fairs or country music concerts. Such gatherings often result in overwhelmingly white crowds due to demographic realities in certain geographic areas or cultural affinities, yet they are rarely acknowledged or organized under the banner of white identity. This lack of explicit racial framing stands in stark contrast to the practices of other racial and ethnic groups, where spaces are frequently designed, named, and celebrated as affirmations of group particularity. Non-white groups, including Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and Jewish Americans, commonly maintain organizations and gatherings that openly incorporate racial or ethnic identity into their purpose and structure. Examples include Black churches that serve as community hubs, Hispanic professional associations, Asian American student unions, tribal gatherings for Native Americans, and Jewish community centers or fraternities. These spaces function dually as practical venues for social, religious, or professional activities, and as deliberate preservations of group consciousness. They are often protected and celebrated as essential for cultural continuity or empowerment, with little controversy attached to their explicit ethnic framing. This duality allows members to advance collective interests while benefiting from the openness of broader society. In contrast, any attempt to create analogous explicitly white organizations, such as European American student unions or professional networks, encounters immediate stigmatization and suppression, often labeled as supremacist regardless of intent. This asymmetry extends beyond mere gathering places to encompass a deeper structural imbalance in how group interests are advocated and defended. White Americans exhibit a cultural tendency toward openness, rational debate, and compromise when differences arise, rooted in historical traditions of pluralism and individualism. This disposition assumes good faith among participants and seeks understanding or separation rather than domination. However, when interacting with groups operating under different mentalities, characterized by strategic advancement of ethnic interests, grievance leverage, or zero-sum competition, this openness becomes exploitable. The result is a one-way process where white spaces absorb external influences and agendas, while minority spaces remain fortified. This dynamic raises fundamental questions about reciprocity, self-preservation, and the sustainability of white communal cohesion in an increasingly diverse society. Part 1. Stereotypical versus authentic white gathering spaces. Initial attempts to identify where white people gather in contemporary American society frequently rely on stereotypical tropes that highlight niche, class-specific, or urban subcultures, such as craft beer bars, yoga studios, farmers markets, indie coffee shops, high-end grocery stores, outdoor recreation groups like hiking clubs, or boutique fitness classes. These representations, though partially rooted in observable patterns among certain affluent, college-educated, or younger segments of the population, fundamentally misrepresent the broader spectrum of white social life. They emerge from media portrayals, internet memes, and cultural commentary that reduce white identity to a set of consumerist or lifestyle choices, often associated with gentrified urban environments or coastal liberalism. For many white Americans, particularly those outside these circles, such venues are entirely unfamiliar and irrelevant to daily experience. Lists of this nature not only fail to encompass the majority, but also carry a derogatory undertone, portraying white culture as superficially privileged, bland, or disconnected from authentic community traditions. In reality, these tropes capture only a small fraction, estimated at 10 to 15%, of white America, concentrated in specific geographic and socioeconomic niches. A far more accurate and representative picture arises when attention shifts to traditional, working class, or regionally anchored spaces that attract substantially larger and more diverse cross-sections of white participants. These include everyday venues such as chain restaurants like Texas Roadhouse or Cracker Barrel, bowling leagues, dive bars offering inexpensive domestic beers and classic rock jukeboxes, Friday night high school football games, deer hunting camps, volunteer fire departments, tractor pulls, demolition derbies, county fairs, and weekend gatherings in big box store parking lots. Fraternal organizations such as Veterans of Foreign Wars halls, American Legion posts, church basements hosting post-service potlucks, and small-town Memorial Day parades also serve as central hubs. These locations reflect the lived realities of the majority of white Americans residing in rural areas, the Midwest, the South, or suburban communities, where emphasis falls on practicality, local tradition, family ties, and shared history rather than trendy or exclusive pursuits. Such spaces draw crowds that are demographically homogeneous due to regional settlement patterns, yet they remain open in principle to anyone who shares the cultural or communal context. The endurance of these authentic gathering places underscores a critical distinction in how white social cohesion manifests. It operates almost exclusively under neutral, functional, or universal banners: school spirit, veterans camaraderie, community service, or regional heritage, without any explicit acknowledgement of racial or ethnic particularity. Even in settings where participants are overwhelmingly or entirely white, the framing avoids overt group consciousness, presenting events as inclusive and accessible to all. This cultural aversion to racialization stands in sharp contrast to the deliberate ethnic framing employed by other groups, highlighting how superficial stereotypes obscure deeper structural asymmetries. Recognizing the true nature of these spaces is essential for understanding that white social networks remain robust and numerous in absolute terms, yet they exist in a form that resists conscious racial articulation, rendering them particularly susceptible to unreciprocated external influences and gradual transformation. Part 2. The absence of explicit white organizations and the prevalence of minority equivalents. One of the most striking features of contemporary American institutional life is the near-complete absence of explicitly white or European American organizations, in marked contrast to the rich array of equivalents available to non-white racial and ethnic groups. Black Americans maintain a wide range of openly race-based entities, including the NAACP, the National Urban League, Divine Nine fraternities and sororities, Black professional networks, and student unions. Hispanic Americans benefit from organizations such as LULAC, MECA, Latino chambers of commerce, and dedicated lawyers associations. Asian Americans have numerous ethnic-specific professional and cultural associations, while Native Americans possess sovereign tribal structures and related advocacy bodies. Jewish Americans sustain an extensive network of community centers, Hillel chapters, fraternities, and advocacy organizations that openly incorporate ethnic and religious identity. These groups receive mainstream acceptance, public funding, university support, and legal protections, celebrated as vital instruments for cultural preservation, empowerment, and collective advancement. This profound disparity took root and solidified following the civil rights era, when explicit white identity became inextricably linked to historical oppression, while minority identity was recast as a legitimate basis for empowerment and redress. The demographic reality of white majority status in many national institutions further complicates white organizing, as any such effort is frequently perceived as punching down rather than as a valid form of self-defense or cultural maintenance. Gender dynamics exacerbate the imbalance. Historically male-only spaces, such as country clubs or fraternal lodges, have been compelled to integrate both racially and sexually, leaving virtually no single-sex options for men comparable to the women's groups that remain protected. White men, in particular, find themselves without dedicated clubs, networks, or advocacy structures, while minority equivalents continue to thrive unhindered. Marginal European heritage societies persist in limited form, often focused narrowly on Irish, German, Italian, or Scandinavian ancestry, but they are typically aging, declining, and deliberately avoid broader racial language to evade controversy. The ultimate consequence of this structural void is that white Americans continue to gather in large numbers within existing institutions. Churches, public schools in certain areas, civic clubs, and fraternal organizations, yet lack formal mechanisms to articulate or defend group interests explicitly. These spaces often remain demographically white due to geographic and cultural patterns, but operate under universal or neutral pretenses that discourage overt racial consciousness. This absence facilitates a one-directional process of assimilation and influence, whereby non-whites can enter and reshape white institutions without facing equivalent pressure to open their own fortified spaces. The resulting asymmetry deprives white Americans of the institutional tools that other groups employ routinely for advancement, perpetuating a dynamic in which white communal spaces gradually dilute and transform over time, while reciprocal access to minority organizations remains effectively non-existent. Part 3. Mechanisms of infiltration and the exploitation of white openness. Infiltration into white majority institutions proceeds systematically through established pipelines that channel ideological shifts into positions of influence, often framed as progressive integration or equity enhancement. In education, seminary and university programs train future leaders who then occupy school boards, human resources roles, and administrative positions, introducing curricula that problematize whiteness and emphasize social justice frameworks. In workplaces, investor pressures from firms like BlackRock and Vanguard historically enforce diversity quotas through proxy voting guidelines, compelling boards to prioritize minority advancement, though by late 2025, these firms began dialing back explicit targets amid political and legal backlash. Media and corporate sponsorships reshape events by mandating multicultural programming, while churches experience doctrinal changes via seminary curricula that incorporate wokeness, diluting traditional teachings with emphases on anti-racism and equity. Financial mechanisms, including grants tied to equity outcomes and investment strategies rewarding diversity metrics, sustain these changes, redirecting institutional priorities away from original cohesion toward agendas that favor incoming interests. At the heart of this process lies the exploitation of a core white cultural disposition toward openness, rational debate, and willingness to compromise, a tradition that presumes conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and mutual accommodation. This mentality invites participation with the expectation of good faith, leading to repeated concessions even when underlying motives involve ethnic favoritism, resource redistribution, or outright dominance. Non-white actors, guided by a mentality that prioritizes group advancement and leverages grievance narratives, strategically utilize these forums to advance ulterior objectives without reciprocal yielding. Debate, intended as a pathway to understanding, transforms into a mechanism for incremental capture, where compromise disproportionately benefits external agendas, eroding the host institution's foundational orientation. This dynamic is exacerbated when financial or reputational incentives align with incoming demands, turning openness into a predictable vulnerability. Demographically, whites represent a global minority of approximately 8 to 12% in 2025, yet persist under a Western majority stigma that facilitates the leveraging of minority status for institutional gains. Individual opportunism blends with broader collective impulses, enabling invited entry followed by substantive rewriting of norms and practices. While not uniformly rooted in overt hatred, the process frequently involves pragmatic exploitation of systems that reward identity claims, exhausting the resources of dialogue-oriented groups. The resultant fallacy, that endless accommodation strengthens pluralism, overlooks scenarios where differences prove incompatible, converting a cultural strength into a strategic liability that hollows out white communal spaces over time. Part 4. Strategies for white advocacy and reclamation of established networks. Countering institutional asymmetry requires whites to actively reclaim long-standing networks, encompassing churches, educational bodies, workplaces, civic organizations, and community gatherings, as platforms for unapologetic advocacy, mirroring the vocal self-assertion employed by minority groups. This entails recognizing these venues as de facto white spaces shaped by historical and demographic realities, then deploying them to advance preservationist interests and illuminate infiltration patterns. In educational settings, parent associations and alumni groups can insist on curricula that expose double standards, such as the absence of white equivalent ethnic studies programs. Workplace networks, whether formal unions or informal alliances, may contest policies perceived as reverse discrimination, particularly as 2025 saw corporate DI rollbacks amid executive orders and investor retreats from quotas. Churches can foster study groups to reaffirm orthodox doctrines against social justice dilutions, while event participants question imposed multicultural mandates through open discussion. Vocalization emerges as paramount. Minorities routinely highlight perceived racism to secure advancements, compelling whites to equivalently identify anti-white bias, disguised ethnic superiority narratives, and financial motivations behind equity initiatives. Employing openness tactically, debating to reveal inconsistencies rather than perpetually yielding, establishes firm boundaries against domination tactics. Within existing structures, heritage-oriented subgroups or parallel initiatives can develop, sidestepping stigmatization while cultivating solidarity and counter-narratives. As major investors like BlackRock and Vanguard soften diversity expectations in 2025, opportunities arise to push for merit-focused reforms without immediate reprisal. This paradigm shift moves from reactive defense to assertive protagonism, insisting on reciprocity and declining unilateral concessions. Amplifying self-interest across scales, from local boards to national forums, enables foothold re-establishment, transforming debate traditions into tools of boundary enforcement and assertion. The ultimate aim remains equitable normalization. Environments where white advocacy achieves parity with others, dismantling encirclement via invitation through deliberate, boundary-conscious engagement that prioritizes group preservation alongside individual fairness. Conclusion: a profound imbalance in racial navigation of American society. The examination of gathering spaces and organizational asymmetries in contemporary American society reveals a profound and enduring imbalance in how racial and ethnic groups navigate social, institutional, and cultural landscapes. White gatherings persist in significant volume across various sectors, such as suburban schools, high school sports events, workplaces in traditional industries, Protestant churches, fraternal lodges, and regional festivals. Yet they consistently lack explicit identity framing tied to whiteness. These spaces often achieve demographic homogeneity through geographic, economic, or cultural patterns rather than deliberate racial exclusion, operating under banners of universality, local tradition, or functionality. In contrast, non-white groups maintain spaces and organizations that openly affirm ethnic or racial particularism, serving both practical and consciousness-raising purposes. This dynamic, entrenched in post-civil rights norms and shifting demographic perceptions, privileges explicit particularism for minority groups while enforcing a universalizing imperative on whites, gradually eroding the integrity and cohesion of white communal structures over time. This imbalance extends to the absence of reciprocal mechanisms for group defense and advancement. While minority organizations receive mainstream celebration and institutional support, any parallel efforts among whites face stigmatization, limiting their ability to articulate collective interests without controversy. The result is a society where white spaces remain physically abundant but institutionally vulnerable, absorbing external influences without equivalent protections afforded elsewhere. This one-sided openness reflects broader perceptions of whites as a perpetual majority despite global minority status, perpetuating a framework where self-preservation for some is empowerment and for others is suspect. Vulnerabilities arising from exploitation of cultural openness. Exploitation of white cultural tendencies toward openness, rational debate, and compromise emerges as a central vulnerability, transforming potential strengths into mechanisms of gradual domination. Infiltration occurs across institutions through channels such as educational pipelines influencing boards and curricula, corporate pressures enforcing diversity mandates, media shaping event programming, and doctrinal shifts in religious settings. These processes often masquerade as equitable integration but redirect resources and priorities away from original communal purposes. Non-white actors, guided by mentalities prioritizing group advancement, grievance leverage, or opportunistic insertion, exploit the assumption of good faith inherent in white traditions of discourse, turning debate into a vehicle for asymmetric gains rather than mutual resolution. This exploitation converges individual opportunism with collective momentum, frequently under the guise of inclusion or justice. Financial incentives tied to equity programs, alongside perceptions of minority status as a tool for redistribution, amplify the process. The white disposition toward accommodating differences, even incompatible ones, exhausts defensive resources, allowing ulterior motives to prevail without reciprocity. Recognizing this pattern is crucial for comprehending the dilution of white spaces and the systemic absence of tools that other groups employ routinely for preservation and advocacy. Pathways to reclamation through vocal advocacy. Ultimately, a path forward lies in the reclamation of established networks through vocal, unapologetic advocacy that mirrors strategies successfully employed by minority groups. Whites must recognize existing gatherings, churches, schools, workplaces, civic organizations, and community events as de facto spaces for asserting self-interest, inserting perspectives on preservation, and exposing infiltration tactics, double standards, and anti-white initiatives. This involves tactical use of openness not for endless compromise, but for boundary setting and illumination of incompatible aims, demanding reciprocity in institutional interactions. By vocalizing concerns over ethnic superiority claims disguised as empowerment, financial motivations in equity pushes, and the exploitation of debate traditions, whites can shift from passive defense to active protagonism. Establishing heritage-focused subgroups or informal coalitions within traditional venues allows for cohesion without immediate stigmatization. This approach restores agency, turning cultural tools of dialogue into instruments of assertion and ensuring that advocacy for white interests achieves normalization comparable to that of other groups. Toward equitable pluralism and conclusion. Rebalancing these asymmetries promises a more equitable pluralism, where cultural traditions of openness serve communal cohesion rather than dissolution, and all groups defend their interests on equal terms. Embracing explicit preservation without apology counters encirclement through invitation, fostering reciprocity in a diverse society. This reclamation not only safeguards white communal integrity, but strengthens the broader framework of mutual respect, preventing domination disguised as progress. In conclusion, the asymmetries in racial gathering and organization underscore a critical juncture for American society. White spaces, abundant yet undefended, face ongoing dilution amid unreciprocated influences, while minority equivalents remain fortified. Exploitation of openness highlights the need for vigilant assertion, and vocal advocacy within existing networks offers a viable counter. By pursuing this path, whites can achieve equitable standing, ensuring pluralism benefits all without privileging particularism for some and universal demands for others. This reorientation upholds the potential for a society where group interests coexist through balanced defense rather than one-sided accommodation. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments section. Visit realfreenews.com for more Real Free News, and check out the Real Free News store for real free food and gear. Tune in again, and until then, remember to keep it real. Free news. See you next time.